Angela Rodriguez was born on May 31st, 1968. She was the youngest of two daughters, and she grew up in a working-class neighborhood of Rockaway Beach in Queens, New York. Her mother was a hard-working nurse, and when they were able to, they all moved to Southern California in a city called Montebello, which is in Los Angeles County. She and her family lived in the suburbs, but life was far from perfect. Despite having a troubled childhood, she had a high IQ and was able to do well in school. She also remained a devout Christian and was determined to become successful. At the age of 20, Angela enlisted to be in the Air Force and then joined the Army National Guard. By this time, Angela was married and divorced for the first time to a man named Hector Gonzalez. She was engaged twice, but those relationships also fell through. She ended up getting married a second time to a man named Tom Fuller. Angela had her first child with Tom at the age of 23, a little girl named Autumn Fuller. The couple had another daughter together shortly after Autumn was born, but she mysteriously died in 1993 at just 13 months old. Angela went to court because she sued the pacifier manufacturing company, blaming them for the cause of her daughter dying. She claimed that the pacifier was faulty and dislodged while it was being sucked. Despite prosecutors thinking Angela removed the nipple on purpose, she was awarded $286,000 out of her $700,000 settlement, and she also received an additional $50,000 because she collected on the life insurance she had on Alicia. Angela and Tom eventually divorced, and Angela moved on to her third husband, Don Combe. Life seemed like a fairy tale on the outside, but their relationship did not last, and they also ended up getting a divorce. Angela was working with the National Guard's Angel Gate Academy, which is our country's only residential intervention program for at-risk middle school students. It was there that she met her soon-to-be fourth husband, Jose Francisco Rodriguez, aka Frank. Frank was a special ed teacher who appeared to be a kind, honest, and hardworking man. The two began a relationship, and in April of 2000, they got married. They had a big wedding with many people wishing them well. To everyone else, it appeared to be a fairy tale wedding with two hardworking lovebirds. Frank was in love, but Angela did not marry for love. A few months after the wedding, Angela took out a $250,000 life insurance policy out on her husband and started thinking of ways to get rid of him in order to collect the money. Angela had even confided in her friends about how unhappy she was with Frank, and instead of doing the right thing and divorcing him, she and her friends joked about ways to kill him. In the midst of their joking, oleander and antifreeze were mentioned. Before deciding to use just that in an attempt to kill Frank, she had given him oleander plants, but had sent him to the hospital with an upset stomach. He eventually came back home, and in her second attempt to kill Frank, she loosened the gas cap on the clothes dryer in their house before she took a solo trip to San Luis Obispo to visit a friend. She came back to Frank alive and well, so her last shot was to use what her friends had suggested, and she put it in Frank's Gatorade. It was September 9th, 2000, when Frank finished his whole bottle of spiked Gatorade and died. That same day, Angela called police to her home on North Marconi Street in Montebello, California, and she casually walked them to Frank's unresponsive body that was face down on top of a pile of food in their bedroom. Many officers later testified that her behavior was not of a woman who just lost her husband. There were a few tears, but any time an officer asked her a question, she would snap out of her acting and answer the question with a straight face. Police officers ended up leaving, and Frank's body was sent in for an autopsy. A few hours after Frank's death, Angela had called to inquire about collecting the life insurance policy money. The first agent she spoke with informed her that she would not be able to collect anything until she got a death certificate. She began to harass investigators and her insurance agent to speed up the process. She grew more angry and more impatient as time went on. One day, Angela was brought in for questioning, and Detective Steinwad and Detective Joe Holmes interrogated her. During this interview, she said that she believed Frank's coworker was involved in her husband's death and named items that could have possibly been used to tamper with his Gatorade. Angela was able to go home, but after she left, the detectives ordered a test, and the results came back with oleander and antifreeze as ingredients in the Gatorade. After receiving the results, they arrested Angela. Her arrest was in February 2001, but her trial did not begin until fall 2003. When Angela's trial began, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge William R. Pounders was presiding over the case. He was quoted saying that Angela was exceptionally cruel and callous, and in the past 20 years, he had never seen a colder heart. Angela had a court-appointed attorney by the name of David Hushin, but she was always against him and accusing him of not being on her side. David said that he tried his best to remain objective and present the best possible defense despite Angela's constant accusations against him, and he even told her that no one wants to have one on death row. Angela also challenged the judge during trial. She said that she did not kill her husband, and despite telling investigators that she believed a coworker killed him, she was now saying it was Frank and Frank only. She made an hour-long speech in court with some quotes being, "I have lived my life with integrity. I have broken and made a few terrible, stupid mistakes that I regret very much, but murder is not on that list." She also said that there is no way she could have laced her husband's drink. Judge Pounders chimed in by asking her, "Are you suggesting he took his own life?" Angela replied by saying, "I know he did. Would your wife be able to hand you a cup of antifreeze? How could I have gotten all that green goop into this intelligent man? I might have been depressed, I might have been sad, but I'm not an idiot." When her friend testified that they all joked about killing Frank, she responded out in court that they were all lying. Although she was not charged with killing her daughter, it was brought up how she died and how Angela was able to collect a lot of money, so prosecutors went with financial gain being her main reason for killing Frank. In October 2003, Angela was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, murder for financial gain, and attempt to dissuade a witness. Prosecutors had charged her with soliciting someone to kill a witness who was scheduled to testify against her in court, but the jurors deadlocked on that count and only found her guilty of threatening the witness. During the penalty phase, jurors later admitted that their decisions were influenced by Angela's lack of remorse. Angela said that she was apologetic for lying and pointing the finger at someone else, but she did not have remorse for a murder she did not do. Judge Pounders officially sentenced her to death by method of lethal injection on January 12, 2004. Judge Pounders also denied motions for a new trial and a reduction of sentence. After Angela's sentence, she made it as the 15th woman on California's death row. She is currently on death row at the Central California Women's Facility. As of today, everyone from Angela's past, except for her stepfather, Jose, does not talk to her. Martin Edward Grossman was born on January 19, 1965. He was raised in Pasco County, Florida as an only child in a devout Jewish home with two loving parents. His mother Myra suffered from mental illnesses which required her to be on prescription medication. Unfortunately, the illnesses were debilitating enough to where she was unable to care for the home, and that left Martin to grow up very fast and handle things on his own. He was doing well in school, but academics were hard to keep up with because his father grew sick and also happened to suffer from mental illnesses. He became his parents' primary caretaker at a very young age. Myra later made a statement that Martin did not finish middle school, but some accounts say that he graduated middle school and dropped out in the 9th grade. Soon after dropping out, when Martin was just 15 years old, his father passed away. The man he spent every day taking care of was now gone, and it caused him to spiral into a depression. After losing his father, he lost his grandfather, a close uncle, and then another relative, and he was no longer able to handle feeling and living life sober. He started using drugs and had easy access to prescription pills because they were pills his mother was taking. Despite him stealing and his new drug habit, his relationship with his mother did not falter, and she mentioned that he always remained respectful to her. She did try and encourage him not to smoke weed, but he continued to do so behind her back. Martin began hanging around the wrong crowds and got into burglarizing different establishments. He got caught and spent time in prison as a young teen, but was released and put on probation. While on probation, he continued to violate rules by using drugs and continued to burglarize homes. On one hit, he was able to steal a handgun and kept it with him at all times. Now 19 years old and still on probation, Martin left his mother's home in Pasco County and met up with his 17-year-old friend Thane Taylor in Pinellas County. It was the evening of December 13, 1984, and Martin thought it would be fun to get high with his friend and shoot around in the woods. The teens thought they were alone, but in the area was a 26-year-old wildlife officer, Margaret Peggy Park, who was in her vehicle patrolling the area. When she drove up to the boys, she put the car in park, put her hazard lights on, and walked to where the boys were standing. She asked for identification and noticed Martin's weapon, and when instructed to give her the gun, Martin followed commands. He handed Peggy his driver's license and his handgun with no issues, and he believed Peggy would let him off the hook. Martin expressed that he was sorry and begged Peggy not to turn him in because he was on probation and he did not want to go back to prison. Ignoring Martin's pleas, Peggy walked back to her patrol car and picked up her radio microphone in an attempt to reach the sheriff's office. In a panic, Martin, who was 6'4", 220 pounds at the time, grabbed Peggy's flashlight, overpowered her tiny 5'4" frame, and began hitting her over the head and body repeatedly. The more he hit her, the more she was able to force herself inside the vehicle. She was able to grab hold of her radio microphone again and scream to the sheriff's office, "I'm hit." Martin became more anxious and asked his friend Thane to help him. Thane began hitting Peggy as well, but she managed to pull out her gun. Instead of firing at the teens assaulting her, she let out a warning shot and was able to get Thane from continuing on with his attack by kicking him in the private area. Adrenaline rushing, Martin was able to overpower a terrified Peggy by grabbing her gun right from her hands. The force of his grab was so hard that he broke Peggy's fingers. Martin then shot Peggy in the head, killing her instantly. The bullet went through her head and landed in a cup that was in the center console of her vehicle. Before Martin and Thane left the scene of the crime, they grabbed Martin's gun that was initially confiscated, along with Peggy's weapon and Martin's driver's license. The boys then left in Martin's van and then made it to Martin's house. They invited a friend over by the name of Brian Hancock, and he later said that one of the first things they told him was that they were never going to get high again. They were covered in blood and told Brian everything they had just done. Brian helped Thane hide 2 handguns, and Martin tried to burn his shoes and clothing. He was unable to get everything to burn, so he thought it would be best to throw all of the clothes into a nearby lake. Martin then went a step further and tried to deep clean his van and changed out all 4 of his tires. He and Thane were still not considered suspects, and a week had already passed. They opened up to another friend by the name of Brian Allen on what they had done. 11 days after Peggy was murdered, Brian Hancock, who had previously helped Thane bury the weapons used in the murder, grew anxious and ended up confessing what he had been told and what he did to the police. Thane was later apprehended and confessed everything to the police, and Martin was later arrested as well. While being held in jail, Martin confessed to other inmates that he had committed murder, and one of those men was Charles Brewer, who ended up testifying against Martin for time off of his sentence. Thane and Martin were tried together. Thane was charged with third-degree murder, and Martin was charged with first-degree murder. Testifying against Martin was Charles Brewer, Brian Hancock, and Brian Allen. Martin had confessed to all 3 men, and they made it seem like it was easy for Martin to kill, and he was not remorseful about what he had done. Along with these testimonies, evidence was also introduced by the state by showing the court the burnt shoes, 2 handguns, and fingerprints on Peggy's vehicle that belonged to both men. There was also a witness Martin was unaware of that saw him burning his articles of clothing. Testifying in support of Martin were 2 correctional officers who talked about his good behavior while being locked up, a childhood friend by the name of Stephen Marticus, and his mother Myra, who testified that her son struggled growing up and had not even completed school. These testimonies did not help his case, and he was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder. Thane was also found guilty of third-degree murder, but since it was a non-capital offense, a death sentence was not on the table. The jury came back with a vote of 12-0, and they sentenced Martin to death on December 13, 1985. They felt that him killing Peggy was considered wicked, evil, atrocious, and/or cruel. The trial judge had also explained to the jury that the crime was a premeditated felony murder because when Martin escaped, he also committed a robbery or burglary by stealing Peggy's gun and taking his license back. Martin did try to appeal his sentence multiple times, and requested a retrial because he felt his legal team did not do a good job representing him. One lawyer said they did a very poor and ineffective job. Another lawyer said he was hired 2 weeks before trial began, and he should have communicated with the trial judge that they needed more time to prepare. A federal judge denied the appeal and request for a retrial, saying that their statements were only made in hindsight, and in the moment they felt as if they were doing a fine job. 5 years after Martin was sentenced to death, inmate Charles Brewer signed an affidavit that retracted his testimony during trial. He claimed that he thought he would be getting a lesser sentence and that authorities gave him a list of questions to ask in order to get a confession from Martin. A judge denied overturning Martin's sentence on the grounds of Charles retracting his testimony because he said there was no evidence to prove that the court knew Charles was lying at the time of trial. Martin spent 25 years on death row, and when it was nearing his execution date, many people learned of who Martin Grossman was and fought to get him taken off of death row. There were over 33,000 signatures signed for a petition to get him taken off of death row, and Governor Charlie Crist received many calls and emails about Martin's case. There were also over 100 rabbis who signed petitions saying that Martin deserved a 60-day stay of execution because they believed the murder was not premeditated and that Martin was high and not in the right frame of mind. The Vatican had reached out to the governor, and Pope Benedict XVI had also heard about Martin's case. They believed Martin had since repented, was a changed man who followed the path of God and deserved a second chance. One member of the Yeshiva world wrote, "Dear Governor Crist, I'm writing to implore you to consider commuting the impending execution of Martin Grossman to life in prison without parole. Although I am somewhat conservative politically and a supporter of the death penalty as punishment for certain crimes, I believe that this case may warrant clemency. The details of the actual crime committed, the murder of a young police officer in the line of duty, are horrific. In ordinary circumstances, I would be in full agreement with the imposition of the death penalty for such a crime. This case has 2 factors that I request be considered in sparing Martin Grossman from the death penalty: his age at the time of the crime and his mental status. Point number 1. A 19-year-old is not fully capable of adult decision-making. States recognize this in imposing a 21-year age limit on the purchase of alcohol. As a member of the Jewish community, I had to ask myself if I'm being honest in requesting clemency due to Martin Grossman's age or simply due to appeals I read in community publications. I am comfortable saying that this belief that 19 is too young to face the death penalty has nothing to do with who Martin is. Many years ago, when actor Bill Cosby's son was tragically murdered, my initial thought was, I hope the killer is caught and executed. Once the murderer was captured, and it turned out he was 19 years old, I no longer thought he should face the death penalty. He was too young. Point number 2. A teenager, a young adult, with an IQ of 77 is not a normal functioning person. While he may survive in society with a menial job, he lacks the intelligence and thinking skills most of us enjoy in our day-to-day lives. He is capable enough to know right from wrong, and he does deserve to be punished for his terrible crime. Nonetheless, his significantly reduced mental capacity should be a reason to spare him from the most severe punishment society has to offer. Allowing a borderline retarded person to be executed would be a blot on the state that permitted it. This is not a request for forgiveness. This is not minimizing the horrible crime and the tragedy of a young police officer's life cut short. This is a request that Martin Grossman be given the next most severe punishment allowed by law, life without parole, instead of execution. Thank you for your time and consideration, Governor. Despite Governor Crist receiving so many letters, it never swayed his beliefs. It was he who reinstated the death penalty in Florida in the year 2008, and many pro-death penalty knew he would not change his mind. For Execution Day, February 16, 2010, at the Florida State Prison, Martin was offered a last meal but refused to order anything and decided to purchase food from the canteen instead. He bought a chicken sandwich, banana cream cookies, peanut butter cookies, and a can of fruit punch. A spokesperson for the prison said that he finished everything. After being strapped in for his lethal injection execution, Martin gave his final words. "I fully regret everything that occurred that night, for everything that was done, whether I remember it or not." In attendance of the execution was the victim's sister, mother, and brother. In a statement from Peggy's sister Betsy, "We came here today hoping for closure and an end to the years of reminders of how Peggy died, overshadowing the memories of how she lived. I believe we realize that hope today." After Martin's last words to everyone, he recited a Jewish prayer to himself, and he was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. Today's story is on Manuel Manny Pardo Jr., who was executed in the state of Florida for killing 9 people in 5 separate episodes. Manuel Manny Pardo Jr. was born on September 24, 1956, in New York. As a young boy, Manny was very respectable and was a Boy Scout. With growing a sense of self and responsibility, when Manny was old enough, he enlisted in the Navy. In the 1970s, after Manny's military career was over, he moved to Florida and he decided that he wanted to continue with a respectable career and ended up joining the police academy when he was 21 years old. He graduated at the top of his class and got his first job after graduating with the Florida Highway Patrol. After some odd years, Manny lost his job with the Florida Highway Patrol in 1979 because he got busted for falsifying over 100 traffic tickets. Instead of firing Manny, they allowed him to resign. Not caring that he was a crooked cop, another police station in the city of Sweetwater decided to hire him. Sweetwater is a small suburb in Miami-Dade County. He played off being a respectable police officer for 2 years until 1981, when he and 3 other officers were charged with brutality. There was no solid proof, and the officers had each other's backs, so after an investigation, all 4 officers' cases were dismissed. Along with dismissing their charges, they were no longer suspended and got to go back to work policing the community. Even though the officers were acquitted of their charges, they still continued to use the police uniform and badge as a cover-up because they participated in criminal activity. In 1985, his fellow thug police friend, who worked for the Sweetwater Police Force, took a trip to the Bahamas. This friend was busted at the airport and charged with drug smuggling. Fearing that his colleague would face a harsh sentence in the Bahamas, Manny flew there in order to testify at his trial. When the trial began, Manny took to the stand as a character witness, but it turned out that everything he said on the stand was a lie. Manny told the court that he and his partner in crime were international undercover agents. Authorities in the Bahamas eventually investigated the two and found out they were lying, so they were both fired from the force, and Manny went back home to his 1-bedroom apartment in Florida to live a regular civilian life. He was not able to live a calm and respectable life, though, because he turned to a life of crime completely. He became a drug dealer and a killer. He would also collect Nazi memorabilia to decorate his apartment, and hate began to fill his heart. On January 22, 1986, Manny and his partner in crime, Rolando Garcia, were given a job by their crime boss, Ramon Alvaro, aka El Negro. Manny and Rolando went to a known drug dealer's house, Mario Amador. Mario was in his apartment with his drug partner, Roberto Alfonso. Mario opened the door for Manny and Rolando because he was under the pretense that they were there to buy 2 kilos of coke. Manny and Rolando walked in with a briefcase that Mario and Roberto thought had money inside. What they did not know was that Manny and Rolando had no intentions of purchasing any coke because inside of the briefcase was a .22 caliber semi-automatic silencer-equipped pistol. While Mario was sorting out the coke, Manny pulled out his pistol and fatally shot Mario and Roberto multiple times in the head and torso. Manny and Rolando then stole all of the coke and left the apartment. It was now February 27, 1986. Manny and Rolando were instructed by Ramon to purchase 3 kilograms of coke from Luis Roberto. Once inside of Luis's apartment, Manny asked if he could use the restroom. Out in the living room was Manny's partner Rolando, Luis, and Luis's partner Ulpiano Ledo. When Manny was in the bathroom alone, he equipped his pistol with the silencer. He then came out of the bathroom and killed Luis and Ulpiano in the same exact signature areas he killed his 2 previous victims, in the head and torso. Manny and Rolando did the same thing as their first double murder and stole all of their coke and left the apartment. Manny's murder count was now up to 4. On January 28, 1986, Manny and Rolando arranged a meeting with a gunsmith by the name of Michael Millett. Michael had previously sold Manny and Rolando silencers. The reason for this visit, however, was not to purchase silencers. Manny had discovered that Michael was a federal government informant, and he assumed that Michael was setting him and Rolando up for a federal bust. Michael was unaware of Manny and Rolando suspecting him of anything negative, so he had no issues following them into Manny's vehicle. Once inside of Manny's vehicle, Manny shot Michael in the head with a 9mm Smith & Wesson. Manny and Rolando then took Michael's body and dumped it in a rural area. In order to eliminate a big crime scene and the vehicle being discovered, they drove Manny's car into a canal. On April 22, 1986, Manny and Rolando went to visit Farah Quintero and Sarah Musa's house. Rolando was upset with Farah and Sarah because he had instructed them to purchase VCRs with murder victim Luis's Visa card, but they failed to do so. The women had no idea they were going to be using the card of a murder victim, so that is not the reason why they did not go out to use the card. On top of Manny and Rolando being upset, they were getting more aggravated because instead of the women owning up to not doing what they asked, they kept pestering the men about $50 Rolando owed Farah. This made Rolando remember conversations he had with other people who claimed that Farah and Sarah would badmouth them when they weren't around. Manny was getting tired of the back and forth and started his normal MO. He asked to use the restroom, he put a silencer on his gun, and when he came out of the bathroom, he came out shooting at Sarah first. He shot her multiple times before his gun jammed, and he tried to unjam the gun and finally unjammed it on Farah's head. Once unjammed, he began to unload on Farah. This brought Manny's kill count to 7. The following day, on April 23, 1986, Manny and Rolando met up with their boss, Ramon. Ramon had been avoiding Manny and Rolando because he had not come through with 2 big coke deals that Manny was depending on. Ramon was able to evade the men for a while, but his luck ran out, and reports say that he and his girlfriend, Daisy Ricard, were at the wrong place at the wrong time. Manny and Rolando made the 2 get into Ramon's car and then drove them to an isolated location. Manny shot Ramon multiple times, killing him, and then shot Daisy once, but then his gun jammed again. He did the same thing he did with his last female victim when his gun jammed, and unjammed it on Daisy's head. The gun successfully unjammed, but he accidentally shot himself in the foot. After shooting himself, he proceeded to kill Daisy. They put Ramon's body in the back of his trunk and then dumped Daisy's body in a secluded area. Manny and Rolando were now behind 9 murders. Daisy's body was found the same day she was murdered at 6:30 p.m. An autopsy concluded that she was shot with 2 different .22 caliber pistols and was missing a shoe. A casing and Daisy's watch was found near her body, and after testing her watch, Manny Pardo's fingerprints were on it. The following morning, on April 24, 1986, Ramon's body was found in the trunk of his car, and it was abandoned 1 mile away from where Daisy's body was found. In the car Ramon was found in, they found Daisy's other shoe, and they concluded that the gun used to kill Ramon was one of the same guns that Daisy was shot with. After killing Ramon and Daisy, Manny and Rolando flew to New York on April 26, 1986, so that Manny could go to a hospital far away from where he committed the murders. Manny was able to check into an ER so that he could be treated for the gunshot wound in his foot. The doctors removed the bullet from Manny's foot, and they just so happened to keep the bullet and sent it in as evidence. Eventually, authorities were able to match the bullet to the bullets that were taken from Daisy and Ramon. Police then obtained a search warrant for Manny's apartment, and once inside, they saw all of his Nazi memorabilia, and they also found a diary with entries of each homicide Manny committed. He was documenting all of his kills. He was saving and taping newspaper clippings in a homicide book, and he also had a calendar book with numbers on certain dates, which corresponded to the number of kill he was on. Lastly, he would take Polaroids of his victims after they died, and he put the Polaroids in a book as well. Authorities were finally able to catch up with Manny and Rolando on May 7, 1986, and they were both arrested and charged with the murders of Ramon and his girlfriend Daisy. It wasn't until June 11, 1986, that the Metro-Dade officials officially announced to the public that Manny and Rolando were linked to a total of 9 murders. Detective Ted MacArthur was quoted saying, "They were drug ripoffs and quantities of coke were taken from the scene." He also made it known that the killing spree ended after their criminal employer Ramon was killed. Okay, so I would just like to pause this video really quick because I'm actually editing it, and as I was looking for images of Detective Ted MacArthur, I found out that he murdered his wife. In one article, it mentions, a detective for the Miami-Dade police force, MacArthur, 38, told the authorities that just for fun, he woke up Pilar MacArthur by squirting her with a water gun on the morning of August 1st, 1989. So this was just a couple of years after he investigated Manny. He then said that in response to squirting a water gun at her, Pilar, who was an officer who was trained with firearms, decided to playfully put the gun to her own head and pulled the trigger. Detective Ted MacArthur said that Pilar most likely thought that the gun was unloaded. I thought this was an interesting fact, and now back to the story. While in prison, Manny would go on to communicate to others that he admired Adolf, and he believed Jews and blacks were truly inferior people that needed to be exterminated. Initially, Manny and Rolando were tried together, but their trial did not start until 2 years later. The lead prosecutor, David Waxman, led with the headline that Manny was an ex-cop gone bad, and he was addicted to coke and easy money. He ripped off dealers for their stash and killed any witnesses in the process. Against his counsel's wishes, Manny took to the witness stand in his own defense. His court-appointed lawyer, Ronald Guralnick, wanted to plead the insanity defense, and he was quoted saying, "The man is crazy. All you have to do is listen to him to know he's totally out of his mind." Ronald knew, though, that the case would not really go in his and Manny's favor if Manny took to the stand. On April 13, 1988, Manny was on the stand. He expressed that he was a one-man vigilante squad, and he eliminated parasites and leeches from law-abiding society. He did not deny killing any of his victims, and he only expressed regret that the total number of his victims was too low for a vigilante. He was quoted saying, "Instead of 9, I wish I could have been up here for 99. I enjoyed what I was doing. I enjoyed shooting them. They're parasites and they're leeches, and they have no right to be alive. Somebody had to kill these people." When he answered about the overkill and how he shot the victims multiple times, he responded by saying that he had to punish them for their crimes. He also said that he did take pictures of their corpses, and he would take one extra picture just so that he could burn it in an ashtray to send their souls to the eternal fires of the damnation of hell for the misery they caused on earth. On the stand, he did deny being a drug dealer, and he said those claims and accusations were ludicrous and ridiculous. Prosecutor David Waxman asked Manny about how he earned $50,000 from selling 2 kilos of coke, as stated in his diary, but Manny responded by saying he only kept $2,000 out of that $50,000 because it was the bare minimum needed for him to purchase guns and ammunition. He then told the court that after he bought ammo, he would remark the bullets, and that would cost him 10 cents a bullet. Prosecutor David then questioned him by asking him if it cost him only $1.30 to kill 2 victims who were shot a total of 13 times. Manny gave a sinister smile and responded, "That's a pretty good investment, isn't it?" Prosecutors and the defense both had psychiatrists who were to testify about Manny's mental state. Civil Marquette was a psychiatrist on the defense side, and he reported that Manny was insane, and he was also insane at the time of all of the murders he committed. He did, however, say that Manny was competent for trial. He said that Manny understood the physical consequence of his actions, but he didn't know right from wrong. The psychiatrist for the prosecution side said that Manny was evil, but he was sane. Manny agreed with the prosecution, and he felt that he was sane, and he made a statement about both professionals. They're whores. Pay them enough money and they'll say anything. The next thing the court discussed was Manny's racist views. This hurt his case as well because the jury consisted of 5 black people and 2 Jewish people. Prosecutors showed the jury his memorabilia that was found in his apartment. Manny also had a Doberman as a pet, and the court showed the jury how his dog had a tattoo of a swastika. Manny interrupted the court by saying Adolf was a great man, and he was the one who inspired him to read about 500 books about his movement. On April 15th, it was time for the jury to deliberate. It took a total of 6 hours, and they came back with a guilty verdict. Manny was found guilty of killing all 9 of his victims, and there were also 9 other felony counts, which included robbery and use of a firearm in the commission of a crime. 5 days after Manny's guilty verdict, the court convened again for the sentencing phase. Defense attorney Ronald, along with Manny's parents, pleaded with the court to understand that Manny had a deranged mental state and to give him leniency. It was now time for Prosecutor David's closing statements. He was quoted saying, "He was weird, but he was not insane." Manny interrupted him. "I'm a soldier. I accomplished my mission, and I humbly ask you to give me the glory of ending my life and not to send me to spend the rest of my life in state prison. I'm begging you to allow me to have a glorious end." The jury complied with Manny's wishes and recommended Manny be sentenced to death. Judge Philip Knight accepted the recommendation and gave the official sentence of death for the killing of 9 people and an additional 15 years in prison for the non-capital offenses. Manny agreed with his sentence, but there were automatic appeals. On March 6, 1990, Public Defender Kellyanne Lance told an assembly of justices that Manny was insane when he committed the murders. Assistant Attorney General Ralph Barrera disagreed and said that Manny was just a man who enjoyed killing. The Florida Supreme Court agreed with Assistant Attorney General Ralph, and they affirmed Manny's conviction and the special circumstances that allowed for his execution under the Florida state law. Just a year later, on May 13, 1991, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the decision. As for Rolando, Manny's partner in crime, I'm going to go through the list of counts for Rolando's mistrials and his sentences. On January 11, 1986, Count 1 was the first-degree murder of Mario Amador. Count 2 was the first-degree murder of Roberto Alfonso. Count 3 was for robbery. Count 4 was for the unlawful possession of a firearm while engaged in a criminal offense. Count 5 was the first-degree murder of Luis Robledo. Count 6 was the first-degree murder of Ulpiano Ledo. Count 7 was robbery. Count 8 was the unlawful possession of a firearm while engaged in a criminal offense. Count 9 was the first-degree murder of Sarah Musa. Count 10 was the first-degree murder of Farah Quintero. Count 11 was the unlawful possession of a firearm while engaged in a criminal offense. Count 12 was forgery by use of credit card. Count 13 was uttering a forged instrument. Count 14 was grand theft in the second degree. Count 15, forgery with a credit card. Count 16, uttering a forged instrument. Count 17, grand theft in the second degree. Count 18, forgery. And Count 19, uttering a forged instrument. On March 11, 1986, the indictment was amended. The only counts to stay were counts 11 through 19, and counts 20 through 24 were added, and they were for forgery, uttering a forged instrument, and grand theft in the second degree. On March 11, 1987, Rolando pled not guilty. On April 15, 1988, a jury came back with a guilty verdict on counts 11 through 24. On April 20, 1988, these were the jury recommendations for the death penalty. In a vote of 8-4, the jury recommended Rolando to death for the first-degree murder of Mario. In another vote of 8-4, the jury recommended him to death for the first-degree murder of Roberto. In a vote of 9-3, the jury recommended Rolando to death for the murder of Luis. In another vote of 9-3, the jury recommended death for the murder of Ulpiano. In a vote of 9-3, they recommended death for the first-degree murder of Sarah, and in a vote of 10-2, they recommended death for the first-degree murder of Farah. In another vote of 10-2, they recommended death for the first-degree murder of Ramon. In a final vote of 10-2, they recommended death for the first-degree murder of Daisy. On the same day, April 20th, 1988, not only was Rolando sentenced to death for the murders, but he was also sentenced to 15 years for the robbery charges and another 15 years for the unlawful possession of a firearm while engaged in a criminal offense. So after Rolando's arrest date on May 23, 1986, he was charged with 24 counts, 8 first-degree murder charges, and 16 related offenses. He had 2 mistrials, and after the second mistrial, he petitioned for his case to be dismissed. The court then severed 5 more counts related to the Sarah and Farah murders, but kept the remaining 19 counts together for the trial. A new jury convicted Rolando for the murders of Daisy, Ramon, Mario, and Roberto, but they voted to acquit him on all counts directly related to the murders of Luis and Ulpiano. The jury recommended death for 3 of the 4 convictions of first-degree murder and life for the remaining counts, so Rolando had 4 death sentences in the end. If any of you noticed, the jury was not unanimous in their voting for Rolando to receive the death sentence, and the same went for Manny. Florida is one of few states that does not require a unanimous verdict for a death sentence. Getting back to Manny Pardo. Despite being openly evil and racist, when he was sent to death row, he received a lot of letters from admirers. Not only were women gushing over him, but men were in support of him as well. One supporter wrote a letter to the Orlando Sentinel-Tribune. His letter was published on April 22, 1990, and some of the letter read, "Manny was never accused of corruption. He was let go for his overzealousness in pursuit of criminals, no matter who they were or whose relatives they were. And lest anyone get the idea that he just cruised around gunning people down, let me point out each of his victims was a thoroughly investigated, tried, convicted, and executed by him, drug dealer, whom Manny had failed to get off the streets via the normal criminal justice system. Manny Pardo does not deserve condemnation. He deserves a commendation. In fact, as research would have shown, Manny had been fired in Sweetwater for showing a lack of good judgment and a habit of lying, specifically in defense of an accused drug dealer, but the details hardly matters. While being held at Stark, Florida's maximum security prison, Manny became known as the Death Row Romeo. In March of 1996, Manny started placing personal ads in tabloid newspapers to attract lonely female pen pals. Some of these women were so lonely and desperate for love that they would put thousands of dollars in his books. They requested that in exchange for receiving the money, he would give them his love. At one point, Manny had a little over $3,500 in his prison canteen account. Some women were sending money and letters, and it is unclear whether or not prison officials would skim some money for themselves, but they made a public statement saying that Manny was not breaking any rules, but he could be breaking several hearts. One heading on his personal ad read, Florida 116-156, Correctional Institute inmate, ex-cop, Vietnam vet, took law into own hands and ended up on death row. He needs letters from sensitive, understanding females for real, honest relationships. One woman in particular who responded was a 46-year-old woman by the name of Barbara Ford. Barbara was from Ohio, and in her own words, she worked as a cleaning lady. As soon as she saw Manny's ad, she wrote him a letter, and it took 3 weeks for her to receive a letter back from him. In the envelope was his letter and also news clippings that described his police career in a good light. What he wrote to Barbara was, I want one special lady in my life. I don't play games because I hate emotional games. I also hate liars and users. No matter which woman Manny sent a letter to, he would always start his letters by addressing the woman as the love of my life. Unfortunately for Barbara, he was talking to multiple women. In some of these letters to women, Manny would complain about his struggles, and he would end his letter with asking these women for, quote-unquote, a few bucks a week to buy personal items like stamps, paper, and shampoo. In one letter to a woman, Manny shared that he had a daughter who came to visit him on death row and quoted what his daughter said to him. Daddy, when I'm older and able to work, I will buy you a radio so you can listen to music, and I will send you money from my weekly check so you can buy coffee, shampoo, and your other needs. Barbara Ford, who made only $7,500 a year, felt so bad for Manny that she sent him over $400. 54-year-old Betty out of Oklahoma was another woman Manny called the love of his life. Manny had been talking to Betty 10 months before he met Barbara, and by the time Manny was corresponding with Barbara, he and Betty had been calling each other husband and wife. Betty thought she was the only one, though, and Manny had sent her 275 letters, and she had sent him over $1,200 out of the money she earned from her part-time Walmart salary. One day, though, Manny slipped up and addressed a letter to Barbara but sent it to Betty. The letter read, "My dearest Barb, hi. I hope this letter finds you in the best of health. I am not a dream, and if my love interests you, well, then it's yours. I love you. Manny." When Betty received the letter, she was extremely upset and was able to send the letter to Barbara, but she also included another letter with an explanation of their relationship. 8 days after Manny sent his slip-up letter, he received a letter from Barbara. Before I read it, I want to let you guys know that in the letter she wrote cretense instead of pretense, and she also wrote haste, and she most likely meant hated, but I am just going to read her letter verbatim. "Manny, you received the money under false pretenses, which makes you a fake and not the man of honor which you profess to be. Needless to say, you are a liar and a hypocrite, the very things you said you haste in people. If you choose not to return the money, I will be your very worst nightmare and expose you for the hypocrite you truly are. I'm not a very patient person, so I hope you respond to my request immediately. The choice is yours." She also included photocopies of money orders she sent him and called him a thief of hearts. Before I continue, I want to ask you guys, do you think that she deserves to receive any money back? In my opinion, that's her loss because in the personal ads, it did say that he was looking for multiple lonely women. On November 2nd, 1995, Manny responded, "Barb, I hope you're in good health. I'm reading your letter and am amazed you think your threats would affect me at all. You and your troubled life will also be exposed. In addition, my attorney will have a field day with you, and that will be your nightmare lawsuit for slander. You are a bitter and vindictive woman. God bless. Manny." Barbara followed through with her threats and went to the governor on November 18th. She asked him, "What kind of people are you in Florida? You have a guy on death row and he still hurts people." She also reached out to a prison official where Manny was imprisoned, and Judy Bletcher responded to Barbara by saying, "No law forbade prisoners from placing personal ads or soliciting gifts from gullible pen pals. On the contrary, Florida has ruled it illegal to deny inmates that privilege because doing so would deny inmates access to the outside world. Many inmates, both male and female, have accumulated considerable amounts of money this way. They are convicts, and some are experts at conning honest people out of their hard-earned dollars. Often, we do advise a person that an inmate is not being honest, but the person will still choose to believe the inmate." With that response, Barbara left the issue alone and left Manny alone as well. Manny was left to continue swindling more women. In one of Manny's final appeals, he first argued that the court made an error in not ordering a hearing on his competency to stand trial. The appeal response was, under the facts of this case, there was no requirement to have done so. The court also asked Manny's counsel multiple times if they wanted a competency hearing, but Manny's counsel responded by saying Manny was competent. The second argument was that the state did not carry its burden of proving that he was sane when the offenses were committed. The appeal response was that Manny did not present sufficient evidence to raise an issue of sanity. They also did not have to resolve that issue because the state presented competent substantial evidence that the jury could have accepted as proof of sanity. Thus, there was no merit to this second argument. The third argument was that the trial court should have granted a motion for a mistrial when the prosecutor said that Manny was trying to escape justice or criminal liability 2 times during their closing argument. The appeal response was that the defense objections to both comments were sustained, and the jury was instructed not to consider the arguments of counsel to be evidence, and the prosecutor was admonished not to use the word escape. The fourth argument was that Manny felt that none of the aggravating circumstances were proven. The appeal response was, "We disagree." The two, referring to specific killings, were supported in the record by a witness who testified that Manny told him one victim was killed because he was an informant and the other was killed as part of a drug ripoff. They also took into consideration Manny's own testimony. Lastly, Manny argued that the trial court should have found the statutory mitigating circumstance applying to defendants who cannot appreciate the criminality of their conduct or are seriously impaired in their ability to conform their conduct to the requirements of law. As proof, the trial judge was supposed to have focused on Manny's testimony that he did not consider drug dealers to be people and that killing them was justified. However, there was no testimony that Manny's ability to conform his conduct was impaired or that he did not know that killing these victims was wrong. In the end, the court did not have to accept Manny's self-serving statements regarding his motives. Ultimately, Manny's appeal was denied. On November 1st, 2012, Governor Rick Scott ordered the execution of Manny Pardo Jr., and the scheduled execution date was set for December 11th, 2012, at the Florida State Prison in Stark. When it was time for Manny's execution, he was told that he could request a last meal, but he would only have a budget of $40, and the ingredients could be used to make a meal in the prison kitchen only. He ended up requesting rice, red beans, roasted pork, plantains, avocado, tomatoes, and olive oil. For dessert, he ate pumpkin pie, and to drink, he had eggnog and Cuban coffee. On December 11th, 2012, Manny was 56 years old, and he was taken to the death row room to begin his lethal injection execution. The drugs were administered at 7:31 p.m., and after 16 minutes, he was pronounced dead. Manny was ready to go because he said that 20-plus years on death row was cruel. Now I have a couple of thoughts and questions for you guys. First, I would like to talk about Barbara. How could you not assume that multiple women would reply to an ad in the newspaper? Also, yes, he was rude and arrogant, provided no apology, but what more can you expect from a lying murderer? Not wanting someone to be executed is different than thinking they are completely rehabilitated and changed for the better. Majority of death row inmates are locked up in a cell for majority of the day. They need company and do whatever it takes to look a certain way to appease others. If he truly loved anyone, I don't think he would be asking for money and over 200 letters sent to them. Also, after hearing about the letter from one of his male supporters, do you think people who send in letters like that and support killers should be evaluated? What if these people are school teachers or doctors? It would be nice to know that someone who needs to work with you or on you feels that it's okay to kill people. These supporters thought Manny's actions were completely valid. Lastly, while on death row, Manny had over $3,000 racked up on his books. He was able to buy so many amenities and snacks. Do you think death row inmates should be able to order a last meal with their own money, or do you think the limit is for the best? Also, if the inmate has no family, what do you think should happen to the inmate's money? I know I said lastly already, but lastly, do you think prison officials steal or skim money out of envelopes from inmates? Ernest Lee Johnson was born on August 20th, 1960. His mother struggled with substance abuse, which caused defects and delays for Ernest that continued on with him into his adulthood. His parents were together, but his mother left the family to live her own life. Ernest had a brother and a sister, and he later recounted that his father would often leave them for long periods of time, not letting them know where he was going or when he would be back. When it came to schooling, Ernest was only ever in special ed classes, but school was not for him, and he dropped out before completing his 9th grade year. He ended up suffering a head injury that went untreated and turned to drugs just like his mother. He was in and out of trouble and had even lived in a halfway house because of his criminal background and drug abuse in order to learn necessary skills to eventually live on his own and reintegrate society. Despite any learning disabilities, he was able to start a relationship with a woman who had 2 sons. His girlfriend's eldest son, Rodriguez Grant, was an 18-year-old drug dealer, and he became Ernest's new drug dealer. On Saturday, February 12, 1994, at around 11 o'clock in the morning, Ernest went to a local drugstore in Columbia, Missouri and purchased a bottle of beer along with a pack of cigarettes. After a short while, he returned to the store for the second time that day, but this time did not make a purchase. Instead, he decided to ask the cashier, Mabel Scruggs, who would be working the next shift. She replied without hesitation and told him that she would be leaving at 5 o'clock that evening and someone would relieve her, but the store would close at 11 o'clock that night. After getting his answer, he left but returned again for the third time. On this third visit, he didn't speak to anyone or purchase anything and was in and out within about 3 minutes. It was now nearing 5 o'clock p.m. Ernest walked into the store for the fourth time that day with a backpack over his shoulder and stared at Mabel while she deposited money from the cash register into the store safe. Again, without speaking or purchasing anything, he left. This time, after leaving the store, he went to his girlfriend's house in order to buy $20 worth of crack cocaine from Rodriguez. Ernest left, went to go smoke, and then went back to his girlfriend's house to buy 2 more rocks of crack. Along with purchasing more crack, he asked Rodriguez if he could borrow the pistol he gave him weeks prior in exchange for crack. Rodriguez agreed, and once Ernest had the gun, he went to the backyard to test the gun out. The gun worked, so Ernest left but returned to the house shortly after, saying the gun was no longer working. Ernest left without the gun, but came back to the house once again, but this time left with the gun, with more layers of clothing on, a mask, and black sneakers. Rodriguez had a feeling that Ernest was going to rob a store because he later mentioned that earlier that year, back in January, Ernest told him that he wanted to rob a store, and he wanted to do it by locking the employees in a room and having one employee open the safe. Ernest returned to the house through the back door at around 11:45 that night. He was covered in blood and immediately went downstairs into Rodriguez's room. He returned the pistol and began cleaning his shoes and removing his clothes. He then put the items in a trash bag and had Antoine take the bag out of the house in order to hide it somewhere. Antoine followed instructions, and Rodriguez noticed that Ernest had a large amount of money, so they counted it and sorted it by denomination. They then hid the money in an air vent. Rodriguez went upstairs but smelled fire. He went downstairs to check on the smell and he discovered Ernest burning paper. Back at the store, it was a little after 1 a.m. when a deputy sheriff arrived after receiving a call for a disturbance involving weapons. Before entering the store, he saw that the lights were on, but the money vault was in the center of the store on the floor. He also noticed blood smears on the door lock. When he and other responding officers entered the store, they discovered 2 dead bodies in the bathroom, along with a .25 caliber shell casing and a third body inside of the walk-in cooler. There was also a shell casing near that body as well. The victims were all employees. The first victim was 57-year-old Mabel Scruggs, who was never able to leave her shift at 5 o'clock. The other victims were 46-year-old Mary Bratcher and 58-year-old Fred Jones. Although there were shell casings, no victims died from a gunshot wound. They all died from head trauma, and the likely weapon of choice was a tool that was found inside of the store. There were actually a few tools that all had blood on them, and Ernest had his way with all of them. Upon further investigation, police spoke with Antoine, who led them to where he hid the items Ernest had him hide. Police found a bag that contained bloody gloves, jeans, and a jacket in a field next to the store. The blood was sent in for testing, and it contained blood from all 3 victims. On Sunday, February 13th, the morning after the murders, Ernest went to a local mall and purchased $200 worth of items. After a shopping spree, he returned to his girlfriend's house, but was soon met by the police, who began asking him questions. He agreed to accompany them to the police station, and while being questioned, he gave an alibi that the detectives did not believe, and he was read his Miranda rights. The detectives later noted that every time they mentioned the store, he would get depressed and at one point said it took more than one man to do the job. Police obtained a search warrant for his girlfriend's house, and they found a bag with over $400 in it, coin wrappers, burned checks, coupons, and receipts that had the store name on it. They also found the shoes Ernest tried to clean, and the shoe prints matched bloody shoe prints that were found inside of the store. Ernest was now under arrest, and when in the booking room, he saw Rodriguez in a holding cell and told police, "That boy didn't have anything to do with this. None of those boys did. I know they weren't there." During the trial phase, Rodriguez Grant was offered a shorter sentence of 10 years in prison for aiding and abetting Ernest before the robbery in exchange for his testimony. As for Antoine Grant, for his testimony, the state agreed not to prosecute him for charges of tampering with evidence committed after the crimes were committed. On June 20th, 1995, Ernest was sentenced to death. While on death row, Ernest appealed his case over the years. One point he made during an appeal was that there were members of the jury who were considering giving him life in prison instead of death. Ernest was able to question the jurors, and his question was, "Do you think that if someone is convicted of multiple murders in the first degree, life without the possibility of parole is a punishment you could still seriously consider?" The first juror responded by saying, "The death penalty is imposed too little or too much in this country." During the penalty phase, the prosecutors objected and the judge sustained the objections. Ernest then asked another question. Where the conviction is done, going into the penalty phase, would you be leaning in the direction of the death penalty going in? He tried to ask more questions, but the court agreed with every objection. Ernest felt that it was not fair he was not allowed to question jurors, but in the appeal response, the court responded by saying they have all rights to disallow any open-ended questions in court. Ernest also argued that jurors seemed uncomfortable during the death qualification phase. One juror by the name of Peggy Edwards said, "I am having quite a bit of stress about thinking that I would be the one to say that someone else wouldn't live." After being asked if signing a death verdict would be something she could do, she replied by saying, "It would be a very difficult thing to do. I am just under a lot of stress about it. I'm not real sure whether I could or not. I'm one of those people that always thought I believed in the death penalty until it comes down to me actually saying yes, I should go ahead and do it." It wasn't until later she voted yes on death for the unanimous recommendation of death despite her previous responses. Another juror, Angela Leap, said that she was having mixed emotions about the death penalty and said she was having a difficult time sentencing someone to death. Philip Moore was a juror who in court said the death penalty was appropriate, but at a later date he admitted that he would be unable to sign a death warrant. Deborah Tapp was a juror who said that she would probably be able to deal with life in prison a little easier. Ernest and his representation felt that there was substantial impairment to performing the duties of a juror. There were more statements from other jurors, but in the appeal denial, the court responded by saying there was no evidence of abuse of discretion. Another point in the appeal was that he felt he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He was drinking and high on drugs and not in his right frame of mind. The court felt that Ernest was voluntarily intoxicated and there was no convincing argument for re-examination. They also said in regards to the emphasis on reasonable doubt, that proof beyond reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. The law does not require proof that overcomes every possible doubt. Another point Ernest made was that he had ineffective counsel. He was represented by Nancy McCarrow and Janice Sembles. For the opening statement during trial, his team said, "Ernest Johnson did cause the death of Mary Bratcher, Fred Jones, and Mabel Scruggs, but he did not do so after deliberation." They also said he had a crack-filled mind when they knew voluntary intoxication was not a defense to murder. His team also failed to call Dr. Sam Parwadekar to the stand. Dr. Parwadekar was a licensed psychiatrist who examined Ernest for any signs of mental diseases, defects, or disorders. The doctor was not called to the stand because he concluded that there was nothing wrong with Ernest at all and did not diagnose him with anything. Ernest felt that the only reason he was not diagnosed was because his legal team did not provide his complete social history. The appeal court responded by saying that Dr. Parwadekar testified that if he did get a complete social history, it would not have changed his diagnosis or lack thereof, so this point was denied as well. Ernest claimed that his team failed to get a neurological exam and failed to call certain witnesses to the stand. Although all of his appeals were denied, many people still wanted Ernest off of death row. Many people still went with the storyline that they were going to be killing a mentally challenged man. The Pope even asked for his pardon. Archbishop Christophe Pierre wrote a letter that stated, "His Holiness wishes to place before you the simple fact of Mr. Johnson's humanity and the sacredness of all human life." 2 members of Congress from Missouri also requested a pardon. For his last meal, he had 2 double bacon cheeseburgers, onion rings, 2 large strawberry milkshakes, and a large pizza. On October 5, 2021, Ernest Lee Johnson, who was 61 years old, received his final denial for a stay of execution from the U.S. Supreme Court and from Governor Michael Parson. He was executed at 6:11 p.m. Central Time on a Tuesday at a state prison in Missouri. Before Ernest died, he wrote a last statement. "I am sorry and have remorse for what I do. I want to say that I love my family and friends. I'm thankful of all that my lawyer has done for me. They made me feel love as if I was family to them. I love them all. For all the people that has prayed for me, I thank them from the bottom of I love the Lord with all my heart and soul. If I am executed, I know where I am going, to heaven, because I ask him to forgive me, God, everyone. With respect, Ernest L. Johnson." Before he died, he also verbally expressed remorse for killing his victims.